The Pacific Ocean is black. Not dark. Black. The kind of black that swallows men whole and leaves nothing behind. It is 3:17 in the morning on July 30th, 1945. Marine Corporal Edgar Harrell is asleep in his bunk aboard the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis, 600 miles west of Guam, in the deepest water on the planet. The Philippine Sea stretches 18,000 feet below the ship's keel, deeper than any mountain on Earth is tall. Above deck, the tropical night presses down with the weight of humidity and heat that never breaks. Below deck, nearly 1,200 men sleep in their bunks, dreaming of the war's end, dreaming of home, dreaming of the moment when all of this will finally be over. Edgar Harrell is 20 years old. A farm boy from Kentucky who joined the Marine Corps because he believed it was the right thing to do. He has been at sea for weeks, and the relentless tropical heat makes rest almost impossible, but tonight, exhaustion wins. He sleeps deeply, his body finally surrendering to the fatigue that accumulates like debt during wartime. He does not know that in less than 2 minutes, he will be fighting for his life in the darkest water on Earth. He does not know that he is about to enter a nightmare that will last 4 days and 5 nights. He does not know that of the nearly 1,200 men aboard his ship, more than 800 will die in the water around him. Not from the torpedoes, not from the sinking, from what comes after. This is the story of the worst naval disaster in American history. Not because of the enemy, because of what the enemy started and the sea finished. This is the story of nearly 900 men abandoned in the middle of the ocean, surrounded by sharks, dying of thirst in an infinite desert of salt water, while the most powerful navy in the world failed to notice they were gone. And this is the story of Edgar Harrell, who survived it all, and spent the rest of his life making sure the world would never forget. The USS Indianapolis was not supposed to be there. 3 weeks earlier, she had been docked at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California, undergoing repairs from a kamikaze strike that had killed 9 men and torn a hole through her stern. The repairs were still being completed when the orders came through: top secret, highest priority. Deliver a cargo from San Francisco to the island of Tinian, no delays, no excuses, maximum speed. The cargo was strange: 2 packages. One was a metal canister about 18 inches tall, secured in a lead-lined bucket and welded to the deck of the captain's cabin. The other was a large wooden crate that required a specialized crane to load aboard. Scientists accompanied the cargo, men who spoke to no one and answered no questions. They stood watch over their packages in shifts, never leaving them unattended, never explaining what they contained. Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III, the Indianapolis's commanding officer, was given exactly enough information to understand that failure was not an option. Every day you save, his superior told him, will shorten the war by that much. McVeigh did not know what was in the crates. He did not know that he was carrying the essential components of the atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima in exactly 11 days. He only knew that the fate of the war might depend on his ship making the fastest crossing in naval history. And he did. The Indianapolis raced from San Francisco to Pearl Harbor in 74 hours, covering 2,100 miles at an average speed of 29 knots. From Pearl Harbor to Tinian, she pushed even harder. When she arrived on July 26, she had set a speed record that would never be broken by a ship of her class. The cargo was unloaded under armed guard and whisked away immediately. The scientists vanished without a word of thanks. The Indianapolis had just delivered the end of the war, and now she was sailing toward the Philippines to join the fleet for the invasion of Japan. She was alone. She had no escort. Her captain had requested destroyer support, but the request had been denied. There were not enough destroyers available, he was told. The route was considered safe, other ships had made the crossing without incident. Nobody mentioned that a Japanese submarine had been spotted in the area 3 days earlier. Nobody mentioned that American codebreakers had intercepted messages indicating enemy submarine activity along the exact route the Indianapolis would travel. Nobody mentioned any of this to Captain McVeigh because the intelligence never reached him. It sat in filing cabinets, it passed through bureaucratic channels, it was marked classified and forgotten. The Indianapolis sailed into the darkness without warning, without protection, and without any way of knowing that Commander Machitsura Hashimoto was already hunting. The I-58 was one of the last operational submarines in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Japan was losing the war, and everyone aboard knew it. The great combined fleet that had once ruled the Pacific was scattered across the ocean floor. The Air Force was down to kamikaze tactics and training planes. The Army was preparing to defend the home islands with sharpened bamboo sticks. But Commander Hashimoto still had torpedoes, he still had a working submarine, and he still believed that one lucky strike could matter. He had been on patrol for weeks, hunting blindly through the Philippine Sea, finding nothing but empty ocean and American aircraft that forced him to dive again and again. The I-58 was equipped with chitin, the man-suicide torpedoes that young Japanese pilots rode to their deaths like living missiles. For chitin pilots were aboard, waiting for the order that would send them on their one-way journey, but Hashimoto preferred conventional torpedoes when possible. They were more reliable. And he did not waste men unless he had to. On the night of July 29th, his sonar operator picked up something in the distance. A faint rumble, engine noise, heavy props. Something big was out there, moving through the darkness. Hashimoto ordered silent running and turned to intercept. For 2 hours, he tracked the sound, closing the distance, maneuvering for position. At 0312, he raised his periscope for the first time and looked into the night. What he saw made his breath catch. A heavy cruiser, Portland class, by the silhouette, alone, on the open sea. No escorts, no zigzag pattern, sailing in a straight line across the moonbright water like a target in a training exercise. For a moment, Hashimoto wondered if it was a trap. American ships did not travel alone through submarine-infested waters. American captains did not sail in straight lines at night. This had to be a decoy, a bait ship trying to lure him to the surface where destroyers would be waiting. But there were no destroyers, no patrol planes, no other ships visible on the horizon, just one heavy cruiser, steaming directly toward him at a speed he could easily match. At 0314, Commander Hashimoto gave the order. 6 Type 95 torpedoes launched in a wide spread. Each torpedo carried a warhead of 1,200 pounds of explosive, enough to break the back of any ship afloat. The I-58 dove immediately after firing, descending to periscope depth to watch. Hashimoto counted the seconds. 20. 30. 40. 50. 2 explosions lit the horizon. The first torpedo struck the starboard bow and detonated the forward ammunition magazine. The explosion was beyond catastrophic. The entire bow section of the Indianapolis, everything forward of the No. 1 turret, was obliterated in a single instant. A column of fire shot 400 feet into the air. So bright that crewmen on the fantail were temporarily blinded. The shock wave traveled through the ship like a seismic event, shattering bulkheads, rupturing fuel lines, throwing sleeping men from their bunks. 12 seconds later, the second torpedo struck amidships, directly beneath the crew's quarters and the main fuel bunkers. The explosion tore through the ship's spine and ignited 40,000 gallons of aviation fuel. Fire erupted through the lower decks with the force of a blast furnace. Men who had been sleeping moments before were now engulfed in flames. Escape ladders melted. Hatches fused shut. The screaming started and did not stop. Edgar Harrell was thrown from his bunk before he was fully awake. One moment he was dreaming of home, the next moment he was on the deck, his ears ringing, his nose filled with the smell of burning oil and scorched metal. The ship was tilting hard to starboard, already listing at least 20 degrees. Emergency lights flickered and died. In the darkness, men were shouting, praying, crying for help. Harrell found his life belt by touch and pulled it over his head. He had been trained for this. Abandoned ship drills. Emergency procedures. But no drill had prepared him for the reality of a dying ship. The ladder to the upper deck was a gauntlet of smoke and flame. He climbed anyway, hand over hand, breath held against the toxic air, eyes streaming with tears from the heat. Above him, he could see the glow of fire through the hatch. Below him, he could hear men pounding on sealed doors, men who would never escape. He made it topside in less than a minute. The fresh air hit him like a wall, clean and salt-tinged after the hellscape below. He filled his lungs, wiped the oil from his eyes, and looked at his ship. What he saw would stay with him for the rest of his life. The bow was gone. Not damaged, gone. Everything forward of the bridge had been ripped away, as if some god of the sea had simply erased it from existence. Where the bow had been, there was only ocean. The ship was no longer shaped like a ship, it was a truncated ruin, open to the sea, already flooding with impossible speed. Amidships, fire poured from every hatch and ventilator like hell itself was vomiting onto the deck. Men were jumping from the rails, their clothes already burning, their screams doppling down toward the black water. The ship was listing further with every passing second, the deck tilting so steeply that men had to cling to railings just to keep from sliding into the flames. 12 minutes. That is what the Navy would later estimate, 12 minutes from the first torpedo impact to the moment the stern rose vertically into the air and the ship slid backward into 18,000 feet of water. 12 minutes for nearly 1,200 men to decide whether to jump, stay, fight, or die. Some never made that decision. More than 300 men went down with the ship, trapped below decks by jammed hatches and flooded compartments. Some were killed instantly by the explosions. Some drowned in the dark, some burned to death in their bunks. The Indianapolis did not give her crew time to escape. She simply died, and she took a third of them with her. But roughly 900 men made it into the water. They jumped from the rails, they slid down the listing deck, they climbed over the side and dropped into the oily blackness below. Some had life jackets, some had kapok vests, some had nothing at all. They clung to debris, to each other, to anything that floated. And as the Indianapolis disappeared beneath them, they watched the surface boil with oil and fire and steam. They watched the stern rise against the stars like a monument to everything they had lost, they watched until there was nothing left to watch. And then it was quiet. For a few minutes, there was almost nothing but silence. The ship was gone. The flames had sputtered out. The survivors floated in total darkness, scattered across nearly a mile of open ocean, surrounded by oil slicks and debris, and the bodies of men who had not survived the initial impact. They called out to one another through the darkness, trying to form groups, trying to find officers, trying to understand what had just happened. Names echoed across the water, prayers rose into the empty sky. Some men were already wounded beyond help, bleeding from shrapnel wounds and burns, their blood spreading invisible through the black water. Some were in shock, unable to speak, unable to respond, floating like mannequins with their eyes open and their minds somewhere far away. Edgar Harrell treaded water and listened to the voices of his shipmates rising and falling across the sea. He was alive, he was not burned. He was not badly wounded. The kapok life best held him afloat. For now, in these first few minutes, he allowed himself to feel something like hope. The ship was gone, but they had survived. Surely the Navy knew what had happened. Surely, rescue was already on the way. Surely this nightmare would end by morning. But what Edgar Harrell did not know, what none of them knew, was that the Navy had no idea the Indianapolis was missing. That is the fact that turned a tragedy into a catastrophe. When the ship failed to arrive in Leyte Gulf on schedule 2 days later, no alarm was raised, no search was launched, no one asked where she was. Due to a series of bureaucratic failures, communication gaps, and simple human negligence that would later seem almost criminal, the United States Navy lost track of one of its own heavy cruisers and did not bother to look for it. The Indianapolis had sent distress signals as she sank. 3 separate SOS messages coded and transmitted in the 12 minutes before the radio room flooded. Those signals were received by at least 3 different stations. One operator was drunk, another decided the signal was a Japanese trick and ignored it, a third logged the message and filed it without forwarding it to anyone. The distress calls vanished into the bureaucracy like water into sand. For 4 days and 5 nights, nearly 900 American sailors and Marines floated in the Philippine Sea, waiting for a rescue that no one had ordered. Waiting for help that no one knew they needed, waiting to die in the blue desert of the Pacific while the greatest navy in history went about its business, completely unaware that an entire cruiser had vanished from the face of the earth. Edgar Harrell spent the first hours after the sinking trying to understand what had happened and trying to stay alive. He had been trained for emergencies, he had practiced abandoned ship drills, he had been told what to do in the water: stay calm, conserve energy, signal for rescue. But nothing had prepared him for the reality of floating in an oil slick at 3 in the morning in the middle of nowhere. The fuel oil was everywhere, it coated his skin, saturated his hair, filled his mouth every time a wave broke over his head. It burned his eyes so badly he could barely keep them open. When he tried to wipe his face clean, his hands came away black and slick, and the burning only spread. The salt water made every cut and scrape feel like acid. The kapok vest was already growing waterlogged, forcing him to kick harder just to keep his head above the surface. As the first gray light of dawn began to spread across the eastern horizon, Harrell could finally see what remained of his ship's crew. The survivors had drifted into 3 main groups during the night, each one separated by hundreds of yards of open ocean. Some men had managed to find life rafts and floater nets, the webbed rope platforms designed to keep men together in the water. Others floated alone or in 2s and 3s, clinging to debris, to each other, to anything that offered buoyancy. The largest group, nearly 400 men, had gathered around the ship's medical officer, Dr. Lewis Haynes. They had no rafts, no floater nets, nothing but their life vests and each other. They floated in a loose cluster, trying to keep together, waiting for the rescue that must surely be coming. Edgar Harrell was in a smaller group, about 80 men clustered around a few floater nets and some salvaged debris. Among them were several of his fellow Marines, men he had trained with, worked with, shared bunks with for months. They tied themselves together with belts and rope, creating a human raft that rose and fell with each gentle swell. That first morning, hope was still alive. Surely someone knew they were here. Surely the distress signals had been received. Surely search planes were already combing the ocean, looking for survivors. Some men talked about being rescued by lunch. Others predicted they would be home within a week. But Edgar Harrell noticed something else that first morning. Something moving in the water beyond the edge of their group. A dark shape, gliding just beneath the surface, circling slowly. Then another, and another. The sharks had found them. The first shark appeared just after sunrise, a blue shark about 8 feet long, drawn by the scent of blood and fuel oil spreading across the sea. It circled the group once, twice, 3 times, close enough that men could see its dead black eyes watching them. Then it descended, vanishing into the murky depths below. More sharks arrived through the morning, blue sharks, white tips, makos. They came from every direction, summoned by the chemical signals spreading through the water, the blood from wounded men mixing with the oil and the salt and the fear. By midday, the survivors could no longer count them. The sharks were everywhere, circling beneath them, between them, around them, waiting. The first attack came in the late morning. A man on the edge of Dr. Haynes's group, already weak from blood loss, was floating slightly apart from the others. One moment he was there, the next moment, he screamed, a sound that cut through the air like nothing human should. Then he was gone, pulled under so fast that the men beside him barely had time to react. A red cloud bloomed in the water where he had been. The sharks descended on it in a frenzy, their bodies thrashing, their jaws snapping, fighting over whatever remained. What followed over the next 4 days was the worst recorded shark attack in human history. Modern estimates suggest that between 50 and 150 men were killed by sharks during those endless days and nights. The true number will never be known. Men simply vanished, one moment floating beside their shipmates, the next moment gone without explanation. Some were taken by sharks, some drowned, some simply died of wounds or exhaustion, and slipped silently beneath the surface. The sharks did not attack constantly. They circled, they probed, they waited, they seemed to test the groups, bumping men with their noses, gauging their reactions. And then, seemingly at random, with a violence that defied comprehension, they struck. Edgar Harrell watched men he knew disappear in seconds. He watched the water turn red again and again around the edges of the groups, where weak men drifted alone, where wounded men bled into the sea. He kicked and splashed and shouted, trying to scare the sharks away, but he knew it did not always work. The sharks kept coming, day after day, night after night. Every man understood the same terrible truth. The ocean was not going to let them go easily, and rescue was not coming. By the end of the first day, the survivors had not seen a single ship, not a single aircraft, not a single sign that anyone in the world knew they were there. The Pacific stretched infinitely in every direction, empty and indifferent. The tropical sun beat down with merciless intensity, blistering any skin not protected by the thick coating of fuel oil. The men who had swallowed oil during the sinking began to vomit, their stomachs cramping, their bodies trying to expel the poison even as dehydration began its slow, relentless work. And still the sharks circled. The second day was worse. By now, the psychological toll was beginning to show. Sleep was impossible. Every time a man closed his eyes, his body would drift, his head would drop, water would fill his mouth and nose. Some men had not slept at all since the sinking. Their eyes were red and swollen, caked with salt and oil. Their minds were beginning to fray. But the real killer had begun its work now. Dehydration. The human body cannot survive long without fresh water. In the open ocean, surrounded by billions of gallons of water, a man can die of thirst in less than a week. The salt in seawater is a poison. Drinking it does not quench thirst, it accelerates dehydration, pulling water from cells, destroying kidneys, killing faster than not drinking at all. The survivors of the Indianapolis knew this. They had been told 100 times during their naval training. Never drink seawater, never. Under any circumstances. But by the second day, some men were already losing that battle. The hallucinations came first. In the shimmering heat of the tropical afternoon, men started seeing things that were not there. Islands on the horizon, lush and green, with waterfalls and cold streams. Ships steaming toward them, already lowering lifeboats. Hotels rising from the sea, with swimming pools and room service and ice-cold water in crystal glasses. The mirages seemed more real than reality. Men pointed at them, described them in perfect detail, begged their shipmates to swim toward them. Some did swim. They broke away from the groups, convinced they could reach land just a few hundred yards away, ignoring the desperate shouts of the men they left behind. They swam until they could swim no more. They did not come back. Others began to forget where they were. The war was over, they said. They were on liberty in San Diego. They were back home in Iowa, in Texas, in Kentucky. Their families were waiting for them just over the horizon. They talked to people who were not there. They argued with ghosts. They laughed at jokes that no one else heard. Edgar Harrell watched the madness spread through the group like a disease. Men who had been rational the day before were now raving, delirious, unreachable. The dehydration was destroying their brains faster than their bodies. Their cells were dying, their organs were failing, their minds were collapsing into fever dreams from which there was no awakening. And then some men began to drink the seawater. It happened quietly at first. A man would become desperate, delirious, convinced that one sip would not hurt. One sip to wet his cracked lips, one sip to ease the burning in his throat. He would cup his hand, lift the water to his mouth, drink before anyone could stop him. An hour later, he would drink more. By the next day, if he lived that long, he would be unrecognizable, raving, violent, completely disconnected from reality. His kidneys would start to fail, his blood would thicken. His heart would struggle to pump the sludge moving through his veins, and then he would die, sometimes quietly, sometimes screaming, sometimes dragging other men down with him. Some of the men who drank seawater became so deranged that they attacked their own shipmates. They saw Japanese soldiers instead of American sailors. They saw enemies everywhere. They dragged men underwater, trying to drown them. They bit and clawed and fought with a strength that seemed impossible for men so close to death. The survivors had to fight off their own men to stay alive. Edgar Harrell watched it happen again and again. He watched friendships of years dissolve into violence and terror. He watched men murder each other in fits of saltwater madness. He watched the group shrink, hour by hour, death by death, as the ocean took its toll. What does a man do when the ocean is killing him, the sharks are circling him, his friends are dying around him, the sun is burning him, the salt is poisoning him, and his own mind is beginning to fail? What does a man do when there is no escape, no rescue, no hope visible anywhere on the horizon? Edgar Harrell did the only thing he knew how to do.
He prayed. Harrell was a man of deep faith. He had grown up in rural Kentucky, raised in a devout Christian family, and he had brought that faith with him into the Marine Corps. His Bible had gone down with the ship, but the verses he had memorized were still with him, burned into his memory the way the oil was burned into his skin. In the water, as the hours turned into days and the days seemed to stretch into eternity, Edgar Harrell prayed constantly. He prayed for rescue. He prayed for strength. He prayed for the men beside him, for the men dying around him, for the men who had already slipped beneath the waves. He recited scripture aloud, his voice cracking with thirst, his words mixing with the endless lapping of the water. Quote _2__. He said those words so many times that they became a rhythm, a heartbeat.
A reason to keep breathing when everything said it was time to stop. Later, Edgar Harrell would say that his faith was the only reason he survived, not his strength. He was no stronger than the men who died, not his luck. There was no luck in that water. His faith, his stubborn, unyielding belief that God had not abandoned him, that this nightmare had a purpose he could not yet understand, that if he kept praying, kept believing, kept holding on, he would live to see another sunrise. But even faith could not protect him from everything. By the third day, Edgar Harrell was hallucinating too. He saw islands that were not there. He heard voices calling him from beneath the water. He felt hands reaching up from the depths, pulling at his legs, trying to drag him down. He saw his mother waving from a ship that did not exist. He saw his shipmates who had already died, floating beside him, asking why he had not saved them. He felt himself beginning to slip away, his grip on reality loosening with every passing hour. The line between dream and waking blurred until he could no longer be certain which was which. Was he still in the water? Or was he already dead, already sinking into the darkness below? But every time he felt himself giving up, something pulled him back. A shipmate's hand on his arm. A prayer spoken into the empty air. The face of a friend, still clinging to life beside him, reminding him that he was not alone. The men in his group held each other together in ways that defied everything they thought they knew about survival. When one man began to slip into delirium, the others held him, talked to him, kept his head above water. When the sharks circled close, they kicked together, shouted together, made themselves seem larger and more threatening than any individual man could be. When someone died, they said a prayer and let the body go. There was nothing else they could do. There was no burial at sea possible for men who were themselves barely clinging to life. They were Marines. They had been trained to fight, to survive, to never surrender. But this was a battle unlike any they had ever imagined. This was a battle against the ocean itself, against the sun, against the sharks, against their own failing bodies and minds. And the only weapon they had was each other. Edgar Harrell would later say that the brotherhood in that water was the most profound thing he had ever experienced. Men who had barely known each other became inseparable. Men who had been rivals became allies. Men who had nothing left to give still found something to offer the man beside them. A word of encouragement, a shared prayer. A hand holding another hand as the sharks circled and the sun blazed and the world slowly ended around them. The sea was calm that week. That was part of the horror. The waves were gentle. The sky was clear. The tropical sun beat down with merciless intensity during the day, blistering any skin not protected by the thick coating of fuel oil. But the nights were worse in their own way. As the sun dropped below the horizon each evening, the temperature plummeted. The Pacific water, which had felt almost warm during the day, now drained the heat from their bodies with deadly efficiency. The survivors shivered uncontrollably, their muscles cramping, their limbs going numb, their core temperatures dropping degree by degree. Hypothermia does not feel like freezing, it feels like giving up. The body stops fighting, the mind clouds over. And men who had survived the sharks, survived the dehydration, survived the madness around them, simply stopped living. The nights were also when the sounds were loudest. During the day, the survivors could see each other, they could watch for sharks, they could track the sun as it crept across the sky, measuring time in degrees of heat and light. But at night, there was only darkness. Total, absolute darkness. A man could not see his own hand in front of his face. He could only hear the sounds of men dying, the sounds of men praying, The sounds of men losing their minds. The sounds of water lapping against bodies that no longer moved. The sounds of screams cut suddenly short. And underneath it all, the sound of the sharks. Their fins breaking the surface, their bodies bumping against men who floated helpless in the pitch black, unable to see what was circling them. Edgar Harrell would later describe those nights as the worst part of the ordeal. During the day, at least there was the illusion of control. You could watch for danger, you could see your friends. You could believe, for moments at a time, that rescue was coming. But at night, all illusions vanished. There was only fear, only waiting. Only the knowledge that something was out there in the darkness, hunting. The groups continued to fragment. What had been clusters of dozens of men became smaller and smaller. Some drifted away in the currents during the night. Some were taken by sharks. Some simply died and slipped beneath the surface, their bodies still held afloat for a time by their life jackets, their eyes open and unseeing, their presence only discovered at dawn when their friends saw who was no longer moving. The bonds of discipline and rank had long since broken down. Officers who had tried to maintain order in the first hours became too weak to lead. Enlisted men who had relied on orders no longer had officers to follow. Each man was alone in his own private purgatory, even when floating next to his last surviving friends. By the third night, Edgar Harrell had stopped counting the dead. There were too many. Names he knew, faces he recognized, men he had served beside for months, pulled under by sharks or simply giving up and letting go. Every hour, it seemed, another voice went silent. Another space in the water went empty. Another man who had survived the sinking did not survive what came after. That third night was the darkest. Cloud cover moved in after sunset, blocking even the faint light of the stars. The survivors floated in absolute blackness, hearing the sounds of dying all around them, unable to see friend or enemy, unable to do anything but wait for dawn. Edgar Harrell prayed through every hour of that night. He recited every Bible verse he could remember. He sang hymns under his breath, his voice barely audible over the lapping of the water. And he held on to the man beside him, refusing to let go, refusing to drift apart, refusing to die alone in the darkness. When the sun rose on the fourth day, fewer than half of the original survivors remained. The rest had been claimed by sharks, by dehydration, by hypothermia, by madness, by despair. The men who were still alive looked almost inhuman, their eyes were swollen shut from the salt and the oil. Their skin was cracked and bleeding. Their lips were black. Their tongues were so swollen they could barely speak. But they were alive. And they were about to be found. On the morning of August 2, 1945, Lieutenant Chuck Gwynn climbed into his PV-1 Ventura patrol bomber for what he expected to be a routine anti-submarine patrol. The Ventura was a twin-engine aircraft, fast and well-armed, perfect for hunting Japanese submarines in the waters around the Philippines. Gwynn had flown dozens of patrols just like this one. He had no reason to expect anything unusual. His flight path took him over a stretch of open ocean far from any shipping lanes. He was checking his navigational equipment, getting ready to turn toward his assigned search zone, when something caught his eye. A long oil slick, spreading across the surface below. Oil slicks in the Pacific usually meant one of two things, a sunken ship or a damaged submarine. Either way, it was worth investigating. Gwynn banked his aircraft and descended toward the water. As he dropped lower, the oil slick became more distinct. It stretched for miles across the surface, a dark stain against the blue, and scattered across that stain were what looked like pieces of debris, wreckage from a downed aircraft, perhaps. Or flotsam from a sunken cargo ship. Then he looked closer. The debris was moving. At first, Gwynn thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The sun was bright that morning, and the glare off the water was intense. But the more he stared, the more certain he became. The debris was not just moving, it was waving at him. He dropped lower still, until his aircraft was barely 100 feet above the surface. Now he could see clearly. Men in the water, not a few, dozens, maybe hundreds. Scattered across miles of open ocean, some alone, some in clusters, all of them waving, screaming, begging for help. Gwynn grabbed his radio and transmitted the most urgent message of his career. Men in the water, large number. Position latitude 12 degrees 2 minutes north, longitude 134 degrees 48 minutes east. Request immediate rescue. The response came quickly, but the shock was palpable. No one at fleet headquarters had any idea what Gwyn was talking about. There were no ships reported missing in that area, there had been no distress calls logged. There should not have been any men in the water at all. What Gwyn had just discovered was that the United States Navy had lost an entire heavy cruiser and had not noticed for 4 days. The bureaucratic failure was almost incomprehensible. The Indianapolis had been expected in Leyte Gulf on July 31st. When she did not arrive, no one questioned it. Her arrival had not been listed as confirmed, her departure from Guam had not been properly communicated. The chain of command assumed someone else was tracking her. No one. Lieutenant Commander Adrian Marks was piloting a PBY Catalina flying boat when he received Gwyn's distress call. The Catalina was a seaplane, capable of landing on water in emergencies, but landing on the open ocean was incredibly dangerous. The swells could flip the aircraft, the hull could be punctured. 100 things could go wrong. No pilot in his right mind would attempt an open ocean landing unless there was no other choice. Marks flew to the coordinates and circled the scene. What he saw made the decision easy. Men were scattered over miles of ocean, some in groups, some completely alone, and among them, clearly visible from the air, were sharks, dozens of sharks, maybe hundreds. They circled the survivors like wolves circling wounded prey. Even as Marks watched, he saw a shark attack in progress, saw a man disappear beneath the surface,
saw the water turn red. He could not wait for surface ships.
He could not sit in the air and watch men die below him. Marks pushed his Catalina into a dive and set up for a water landing. The landing was rough, the swells slammed against the hull with enough force to buckle the metal. The aircraft shuddered and groaned, water began seeping through the damaged seams. Marks knew immediately that his plane would never fly again. He did not care. He taxied the crippled Catalina toward the nearest group of survivors, and began pulling men out of the water. One by one, he hauled them into the cramped cabin, packing them together like cargo, ignoring the water leaking through the hull, ignoring the damage accumulating with every passing minute. By the time he finished with the first group, the Catalina was dangerously overloaded. But there were more men in the water, men still dying. Marks made an impossible decision. He tied parachute cord to the wings of his aircraft and lashed survivors to them, their bodies trailing in the water, finally safe from the sharks that had been circling them for 4 days. By nightfall, 56 men had been rescued by that single broken aircraft. 56 men who would have died before morning if not for a pilot who was willing to destroy his own plane to save them. Other aircraft arrived through the afternoon, dropping life rafts and supplies to the scattered groups of survivors. And as darkness fell, the first surface ships reached the scene. The destroyer USS Cecil J. Doyle was the first to arrive. Her captain, Graham Claytor, made another impossible decision. He turned on his searchlight and pointed it straight up into the sky, creating a beacon visible for miles across the dark ocean. In any other circumstance, this would have been suicidal. A light that bright would draw Japanese submarines from every direction. But Claytor knew what was in the water below him. He knew that men who had survived for days of hell were still out there, still dying, still waiting to be found. He was willing to risk his ship to save them. More destroyers arrived through the night. The USS Ringness, the USS Register, the USS Bassett. They spread out across the search zone, their searchlights sweeping the water, their crews pulling survivors aboard one by one. The rescue continued through the night and into the next morning, August 3rd. Edgar Harrell was among those pulled from the water that night. He could barely see when the rescue boat reached him. His eyes were swollen almost completely shut. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His tongue was so swollen he could not speak. He had lost weight measured in dozens of pounds. He barely looked human anymore. But he was alive. Against everything. Against all odds. Against the sharks, and the sun, and the salt, and the madness. Edgar Harrell was alive. When his rescuers lifted him from the water, he felt something he had not felt in 4 days, hope. Not the desperate, fading hope of the drowning man, real hope, the knowledge that he would see land again, that he would drink fresh water again, that he would live. He would learn later that the final count was devastating. Of the approximately 1,196 men who had been aboard the Indianapolis when she was torpedoed, roughly 880 had made it into the water alive. Of those 880, only 316 were pulled from the sea alive. The rest had died, waiting for a rescue that took 4 days to begin. The Navy moved quickly to contain the story. In the final days of the war, with victory in the Pacific finally within reach, the last thing the military needed was a scandal. The sinking of the Indianapolis was kept quiet. The survivors were scattered to different hospitals. The families of the dead were not told the truth about how their sons and husbands and brothers had died. And then the Navy found a scapegoat. Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III was court-martialed in November 1945, barely 3 months after the sinking. The charge was, quote, it was unprecedented. In the entire history of the United States Navy, no captain had ever been court-martialed for losing his ship to enemy action. But McVeigh was going to be the first. The trial was a travesty of military justice. The Navy's own experts testified that zigzagging would likely have made no difference. The ship was traveling on a moonless night, the submarine had already been tracking her for hours. The torpedoes would have found their target regardless of evasive maneuvers. Even Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, the Japanese commander who had sunk the Indianapolis, testified that zigzagging would not have saved the ship. He stated under oath that his torpedoes would have hit regardless. It did not matter. The Navy needed someone to blame. They could not blame the bureaucracy that had failed to track the ship. They could not blame the communications officers who had ignored the distress signals. They could not blame the system that had allowed an entire heavy cruiser to vanish without anyone noticing. So, they blamed the captain. McVeigh was convicted. His career was effectively over. He was given a desk job and eventually retired from the Navy, his record forever stained by a court-martial for something that was not his fault. For the rest of his life, Captain McVeigh received hate mail from the families of the dead. Letters telling him he had murdered their sons, letters demanding answers he could not give. Letters filled with rage and grief and a need to blame someone, anyone, for the loss that could not be undone. The letters continued for more than 20 years. They never stopped. On November 6, 1968, Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III walked onto his front lawn, holding a small toy sailor that his father had given him when he was a child. He put a Navy revolver to his head and pulled the trigger. He was 70 years old, and he was still officially guilty of sinking his own ship. The survivors never accepted that verdict. From the moment of McVeigh's conviction, they fought to clear his name. They wrote letters, they petitioned Congress. They testified at hearings. They told anyone who would listen that their captain was innocent, that he was being blamed for failures that were not his fault, that the Navy was covering up its own incompetence by sacrificing one man. Edgar Harrell was among the most vocal of these advocates. He had been in the water. He had watched his shipmates die. He knew exactly who was responsible, and it was not Captain McVeigh. It was the system, the bureaucracy. The Navy that lost track of its own ship and did not bother to look for it. The Navy that ignored distress signals and failed to communicate. The Navy that let nearly 900 men float and die while paperwork gathered dust in filing cabinets. For more than 50 years, the survivors fought. And finally, they won. In the fall of 2000, Congress passed a resolution declaring that Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III was exonerated for the loss of the USS Indianapolis. The resolution stated that he had not been responsible for the sinking of his ship, and that his court-martial had been unjust. President Clinton signed an order amending McVeigh's naval record to reflect his exoneration. Edgar Harrell was present when the resolution was announced. He was 75 years old. He had been fighting for McVeigh's exoneration for more than half a century. When the announcement came, he wept. Justice delayed is still justice, and the man he had served under, the man who had been blamed for everything, was finally free. But the exoneration came too late for Captain McVeigh. He had been dead for 32 years. He never knew that his name would be cleared. He never knew that the men who had survived the nightmare would fight for him until the very end. He died believing he had killed his own crew. Edgar Harrell carried the weight of the Indianapolis for the rest of his life. But, unlike Captain McVeigh, he found a way to transform that weight into something meaningful. After the war, Harrell returned to Kentucky. He tried to live a normal life, to put the nightmare behind him, to move forward. But the memories would not let him go. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in the water. Every time he heard a sudden noise,
he was reaching for his life vest. Every time he saw the ocean, even in photographs, he felt the sharks circling.
For years, Harrell could not speak about what had happened. The trauma was too deep, the wounds were too raw. He buried it all, pushing the memories down, refusing to talk about the Indianapolis, even with his closest friends and family. But faith works in mysterious ways. Harrell had prayed in the water, he had clung to his belief in God when everything around him was darkness and death. And eventually, that faith gave him the strength to do something else. To tell the truth. To bear witness, to make sure the world would never forget. In the 1970s, Edgar Harrell began speaking publicly about the Indianapolis. At first, the audiences were small. Veterans groups, church congregations, local civic organizations. But word spread. The story was too powerful to contain.
Soon Harrell was speaking to thousands of people, traveling across the country, telling anyone who would listen about what had happened in those 4 days of July 1945. He wrote a book, Out of the Depths, an unforgettable World War II story of survival, courage, and the sinking of the USS Indianapolis. It became one of the definitive accounts of the disaster, written not by a historian or a journalist, but by a man who had lived it. Every page carried the weight of lived experience. Every sentence was soaked in salt water and blood and memory. He became close friends with some of the other survivors. Men who shared the same nightmares. Men who had floated beside him in the darkness. Men who understood, in ways that no one else ever could, what it meant to survive when so many others had died. They held reunions. They shared stories. They prayed together. And they testified, again and again, to the truth of what had happened. In 2017, 72 years after the sinking, a team of researchers led by billionaire Paul Allen discovered the wreck of the USS Indianapolis. The ship was found at a depth of 18,000 feet, resting on the floor of the Philippine Sea, her hull remarkably intact, her guns still pointing forward toward an enemy that no longer existed. Edgar Harrell was 92 years old when the discovery was announced. He watched the footage of the wreck, the cameras descending through the blackness, the silhouette of his ship emerging from the gloom. He saw the very decks he had walked on, the very hull that had sheltered him, now resting in eternal darkness beneath the Pacific. Our shipmates remain there, he said. And now the world knows exactly where they are. Edgar Harrell died on August 26, 2021, at the age of 96. He was one of the last surviving crew members of the USS Indianapolis. He had spent more than 7 decades telling the story of what happened in those 4 days of hell. He had fought for Captain McVeigh's exoneration. He had written the book. He had given the speeches. He had borne witness, and he had never stopped praying. The sinking of the USS Indianapolis remains the worst naval disaster in American history. Not because of the torpedoes that struck her, not because of the speed with which she sank, but because of what happened after. Because 900 men floated in the Pacific Ocean for 4 days and 5 nights, dying one by one from sharks and dehydration and madness and despair, while the greatest navy in history failed to notice they were missing. That failure was not the fault of Captain McVeigh. It was the fault of a system that valued paperwork over human lives. It was the fault of communication chains that broke at every link. It was the fault of officers who ignored distress signals, and clerks who filed reports without reading them, and commanders who assumed someone else was tracking the ship. It was the fault of everyone and no one, which is why for so long, it was easier to blame one man than to face the truth. But the survivors knew the truth. Edgar Harrell knew the truth. And they made sure the world would never forget. Sometimes the torpedo is less deadly than the silence that follows. Sometimes the enemy kills fewer men than your own bureaucracy. Sometimes survival is not about strength or courage or even luck. It is about holding on one more hour, one more minute, one more breath, until somebody finally notices you are gone. The men of the Indianapolis held on. 316 of them held on long enough to be saved. Nearly 600 did not. But every single one of them, the living and the dead, deserves to be remembered. Edgar Harrell spent his life making sure they would be. In the summer of 1945, the USS Indianapolis carried the end of the war across the Pacific. She delivered the weapon that would force Japan's surrender. She completed the mission that would save hundreds of thousands of American lives. And then, in the dead of night, she was torpedoed and sunk, and nearly 1,200 men went into the water, and the Navy did not notice for 4 days. That is the story of the Indianapolis. That is the story Edgar Harrell told until he could no longer tell it. That is the story that must never be forgotten. The Pacific Ocean is still there, black, patient, eternal. 18,000 feet below the surface, the Indianapolis rests in darkness, her secrets finally revealed, her crew finally at peace. And somewhere in that darkness, nearly 900 men still wait, their names inscribed on markers they will never see, their sacrifice remembered by a nation that came too late to save them. But they are not forgotten. Edgar Harrell made sure of that. The survivors made sure of that. And as long as anyone remembers what happened in those 4 days of July 1945, the men of the USS Indianapolis will never truly be gone. They are still out there, in a sense. Still floating. Still waiting. Still hoping someone will notice they are missing. Someone finally did.